Hi, I'm Bob Dixon. Welcome to the Eagle Insight Podcast, your go-to source for bold and actionable leadership insights. With more than 30 years as a military officer and a strategist, I know leadership is about real impact. In this series, I sit down with top industry leaders to uncover their challenges and their success secrets. Ready to elevate your leadership? Well, hit subscribe. And if you'd like to be a guest, visit 5eaglesleadership.com/interview. Let's dive in. Hi, welcome back to the Eagle Insight Podcast. And this is where we help leaders in every industry be their very best. Today's guest is, it's a treat for me. I'm talking to Daniel Strause, who has been very active in the pharmaceutical industry, but not in the way that I would have expected when I first met him. He's actually on I would say, a campaign or a mission to expose what PBMs are, what they do, and how it affects all of us. And from a leadership standpoint, I think it's fascinating. Daniel, thank you for being here.
I appreciate you having me on, Bob.
So when we first started talking, I couldn't spell PBM. I did not know what that acronym or that abbreviation stood for. Tell us what those are.
It's an acronym for Pharmaceutical Benefit Manager that 99% of America has never heard of before, but you'd be shocked to find out they are the most significant influence of why we have the hyperinflation in our pharmaceutical spend.
So it's amazing to me that something that affects nearly every American, we don't even know anything about it as an American public. Very few of us, anyway, know anything about it. So why is that? Why don't we know about these things?
You know, it has an interesting history, and it started out like many things innocuous and benign, and then through a set of circumstances, and as we'll find out here shortly, two well-intentioned, significant federal legislation pieces created loopholes that allowed savvy folks to manipulate it to a hyper extent. So back in the 60s or 70s, when employers first started including the pharmaceutical as part of their health plan, John's Tire and Susie's Flower Shop and John Doe Manufacturing, they didn't want to write 100 checks to 100 different pharmacies. And quite frankly, pharmacies didn't want to receive a check from 1,000 different companies. So originally, the Pharmaceutical Benefit Manager was just an administrative function. They would receive one check from Joe's Tires and one check from Susie's Flower Shop and one check from John Doe Manufacturing, and then write one check to each pharmacy. So it was about 6 cents a transaction, very innocuous, but all sides were happy because it performed an administrative task. Shortly thereafter, Joe's Tire and Susie's Flower Shop and John Doe Manufacturing realized they don't have the internal expertise to develop what's called a formulary. A formulary is simply what drugs are we going to cover for what disease state? Well, who's best positioned to do that? A pharmacist. So the PBMs hired a pharmacist and simply said, what is the best value out there? And for the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was done in a reasonable and fair manner because the spend was low and the intention was as simply as pharmaceutical A was better than pharmaceutical B at this cost. So it was done as you probably intentioned or you would expect. So those are two relatively innocuous type of tasks that don't really require regulation. So PBMs from the onset for 30 years, why do you need to regulate that? They're just doing an administrative function. So for roughly 30 years, that industry was simply an innocuous middleman doing a task, and no harm, no foul. It was liked by all. Then Medicare D in 2003 hit that fundamentally changed the game. Medicare D, well-intentioned bill to allow senior citizens access to pharmaceuticals to hopefully prevent hospitalizations and increase chronic care. With that, now we have the first bit of collusion. So here's where things kind of start fitting together. Pharmaceutical companies and PBMs then went to the federal government and said, you're about to become the biggest purchaser of prescription medicines in world history. Let us help you use that big stick to your benefit. That makes perfect sense, right? Except for, they said, how are you going to do that? They said, well, you know those anti-kickback laws that are pervasive throughout the federal government to make sure that people aren't misbehaving? We want an exemption from that. So yes, in 2003, Pharmaceutical companies and PBMs got a get out of jail free card, got an exemption for pharmaceuticals. So then you start having significant games because now they had a legal black box to be able to manipulate prices. It's kind of a point of reference to bring folks together, as we're all familiar with insulin for diabetic patients. In the 1990s, insulin cost $10, was over-the-counter medicine. You did not even need a prescription. As of 2 years ago, it cost $594, and the cost to actually make a vial of insulin is about $1. So I want to put that in perspective. In the 1990s, in a normal, healthy market, it was $10. Nobody went bankrupt because of insulin. Nobody went without. You didn't have people losing their toes, going blind or dying because they couldn't afford insulin. Now it's a national epidemic, and we'll get to it later about the actual lawsuits that are going on. The states and employers and the federal government is even suing for this collusion. But that's kind of just telling a big story in a short period of time. So 2003 is when things changed.
Yeah, it's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. So if you're really objective about it and you're looking at this from the outside, you say, okay, so we created this thing to do some administrative tasks, and then it just kind of grew into something that wasn't just doing administration, it was absolutely manipulating what was going on in order to create profits.
Exactly.
Well, okay. But who are these PBMs? I mean, they're not just a bunch of bureaucrats somewhere. They belong to somebody.
Absolutely. And I'm going to tie in one other big piece of legislation, and it'll really come together. But to your point, in 2003, there's roughly 60 PBMs. So you still had, I'm going to call it a relatively normal marketplace where there's checks and balances. If any one player got too far out of line, there's competition to keep it somewhat sane. Unfortunately, in the last 10 years, there's been a hyper consolidation where you now have three conglomerates that own over 85% of the U.S. market. So your leaders
Just three.
Just three. So I believe every business owner and leader out there can automatically say, wow, if you got an oligopoly of three players that dominate a $4.5 trillion market, they have the ability to do some significant profiteering. And that's exactly what's been occurring.
Wow.
So the big three, I want to kind of put the rest of the pieces together for your listeners. So Medicare D was one significant piece of legislation. The second one was the Affordable Care Act. Now, I'm not here to slam that because that was also well-intentioned. So, but like everything else, there's a loophole, and smart people exploit loopholes. So the intent was to get more people into the healthcare system, ideally to prevent more chronic disease and prevent hospitalization. So again, I think it was well-intentioned. There was a lot of merit at the beginning. In order to get the health insurers on board, health insurers said, well, we're going to be taking an enormous amount of risk. We need to feel comfortable that we aren't going to be harmed. So much like the utility industry, the compromise was, hey, health plans, we'll let you have 15 to 20% of a spend as an admin fee to make sure you do this. Now, to us bean counters, that not all the flags are going up and bells and alarms. A lot of folks says, well, that seems fair. Well, if it was 10 to 15% is a fiduciary and there was some oversight, like in utilities, then yes. But in this case, there is no oversight. So that allows free reign then to manipulate. And usually we give like the following example. Let's say that one of your employees needs a surgery, and hospital A will do it for $10,000. Hospital B will do it for $60,000. Every one of us, assuming that the quality is the same, would just automatically assume we were going to go to the 10,000 surgery, right? The answer is no. If you're a CEO for a health insurer and you can make 20% on a $60,000 spend versus 20% on a $10,000 spend, you are not doing your fiduciary duty to your shareholders. So there is probably the biggest surprise that most employers have is your health insurers are actually incentivized to spend more of your money without you knowing about it. So now where do these worlds come together? Well, PBMs were an absolute cherry then for those health insurers. Because if you can almost guarantee that you're going to increase the cost of pharmaceuticals every year, then you can guarantee your 15 to 20% admin fees going up every year. And with the significant rebates, you can get a cut of the action of the rebates. So what occurred? The big three insurers bought the big three PBMs. They made so much money, they bought their own mail order pharmacies and brick and mortar. And because of their insurance company, that insurance card can patient steer patients into those channels so you can ensure that you profiteer every step of the way. So the big three are
Oh,
united.
so they're not just making money for themselves, they're making money for their parent organization, and they're manipulating the choices that we think we have and that healthcare professionals think that they have. No longer have choices because they're being steered towards something that maximizes profits for both the PBMs and their parent companies, which happen to be pharmaceuticals or insurance.
Exactly. So, and it's gotten,
Holy smoke.
yes, and it's gotten even worse because one of the biggest scams out there is mail order pharmacy, right? Hey, it's
So
cheap.
that's a scam. That, I mean, it seems like it's a good deal for folks, right? Employers encourage their employees to participate in mail order, and you're saying it's not on the up and up, huh? It's not. It's not actually the benefit we think it is.
Correct. And just so your listeners doesn't think it's just my opinion, the FTC has issued a study on this, as has the U.S. Oversight Committee. The U.S. Oversight Committee has documented evidence that a $16 cancer drug was being charged $7,000 to the employer in the plan. Another part is they're master manipulators. So they'll say, well, wait a minute, we're cheaper, right? And when you do a study, 21% of the time they are 1 penny cheaper. 79% of the time they're significantly more expensive. The only way to
Hmm.
do it is have transparency and see your data. So the best way, it's all about behavior change. And if you hear enough that mail order is a good deal, you just assume it. But here is the 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 brilliance and the insidiousness of this. They're controlling the data. Hey Bob, if you go on my mail order, I'll save you 50%. Man, that sounds good, but 50% of what? If a drug should cost $50, I marked up to 5,000. I give you 50% discount and save you $2,500. You're still paying $2,500 for a $50 drug. So you might say, well, how?
Wow.
Yes,
You're saving me. Well, this is like going to a sale at one of the major retailers that say 50% off, and they jack the price up by several $100s, and then they give you 50% back. But they're doing this at scale.
at scale, at scale.
Oh boy.
And here's where it's really really hits home. 60% of all bankruptcies in America have to do with healthcare. 75% of those bankruptcies are people that are fully insured. Employers are not even
Wow.
realizing the very vendors they're picking for their insurance has a direct causal effect on their employees' bankruptcies. And I'll go back to those two examples I gave, which is if all of a sudden that $10,000 surgery all of a sudden costs 60, there's usually some type of cost share there, right? The company's probably paying half to 2/3, and employees paying half to 2/3. So when you're paying half of 10,000 versus half of 60, that's the difference between people uh, being financially harmed significantly.
That's amazing. Yeah, and most people don't even realize the. It's easy to sit back and say, "Look, healthcare is so expensive, the system is broken," but not that many people are looking into why it's broken and who's kind of leading the industry into that brokenness.
Absolutely, and it's hard, right? Because if you're a John's Tire Shop and Susie's Flower Shop and Joe Manufacturing, you're busy running your business. You didn't go to school to learn about healthcare. So the procurement for healthcare is usually so much different than the rest of the procurement for your company, right? Because many times if you're buying parts or machine or materials, you'll hire someone specifically that's really good at that, and they'll have contracts that are transparent. Right? It's always fascinating. We'll invest more in legal fees on a purchase order for a paperclip than we do on what's often our second biggest spend. Like usually right behind labor, your second biggest spend is your health insurance cost. So the vast majority of employers will hire a broker. Hey, they're good at that. Now, what I found talking to fellow peers, fellow CEOs, that usually resonates the best is everybody usually recognizes what a fiduciary is, right? Somebody has to act in your best interest and not their own. And maybe the best way I can kind of put this is the vast majority of folks utilize a broker who are not fiduciaries. They then will take your data to go to two competing health plans or health insurers who are not your fiduciary, who then hires a PBM who's not only not your fiduciary, but when you never see the contract between a PBM and a health insurer, which they won't share with you, but we have, it actually has a paragraph there specifically saying that PBMs are not a fiduciary to the plan or to the employer. And those of us who are familiar with that term, that's a clear cut saying we're here for the money. And as an employer, and I found this out the hard way. We were fully insured for many years. And like most of your listeners, it was the same old story. Every year, you have a 15% premium increase. Well, you maybe are not going to afford that, so you increase your copays or increase your deductibles, etc.
Right.
And then you talk about utilization rate. Well, what's the utilization rate? Well, that's your spend. One year, our spend was actually less than anticipated, so I thought we were going to get a premium decrease. No, that doesn't work that way. I go, wait a minute, something doesn't smell right here. So I started asking a lot of questions, and we were in a unique position because we owned 50 pharmacies. So I could really dig deep into the pharmacy spend. And I said, I'd like to see my pharmacy data. I had to fight and almost threaten legal action. And they kept on saying, we can't do that because of HIPAA. I said, I want a HIPAA scrubbed. I don't care about John Doe had drug A. I just want to know how many dollars I actually spent in my plan. Because I know how many dollars came off my own shelf to my own employees. So $60,000 came off my shelves to give to my own people. Guess how much the health plan cost us for taking our own inventory and giving it to our own people? $360,000. They don't mark it up.
Well, that's a pretty good profit margin for them.
So they made $300,000 on drugs that cost us $60,000 to give to ourselves. So that's what really opened the eyes, saying, okay, this happened to us. And then as we found out the last 10 years, that is normal. That is why Americans are going bankrupt, is because drugs aren't getting marked up a reasonable percentage. It's really getting marked up 500-600%. And they'll go back to insulin, because insulin to me is a crime. And the reason why I'm using that strong language is the federal government agrees with me. So now there are multiple lawsuits, multiple states, the Department of Justice, and the FTC is suing the pharmaceutical companies and the PBMs for price collusion. And many of your listeners might have a gift. They might actually be eligible to be able to receive benefits from that because they've been overcharged if they're self-insured.
So that's something for you to pay attention to out there, listeners. If you are self-insured, that you might want to pay attention to what's going on with those lawsuits, because there could be some gain for you in that. It's interesting to me that when I look at this as a leadership problem within the companies themselves, just looking at the PBMs themselves. So just a quick Google search will tell you that they have the kind of corporate values that you would expect.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the big three is their values as integrity, mutual respect, passion, alignment, collaboration, and service. Integrity, mutual respect stand out to me. Now, they could be passionate about making great profits, and I don't know what alignment means until I looked into it, and it's basically that we follow the letter of the law. So that was a value, is making sure that we don't break a law as we and our lawyers interpret it. But the first two, integrity and mutual respect, it doesn't seem that the PBMs are respecting their clients. They're not well unless they consider their clients as the profit gouging insurance companies, but not the patients,
Mhm.
right? Not the consumer. They don't represent them, as you mentioned, as a fiduciary responsibility for them. They are about making profits for themselves and for the drug companies and for the insurance companies, but they're not there to help, Main Street Joe get the pharmaceuticals that he needs at a reasonable price. And I'm not sure how that meshes with that value of integrity. And the reason I bring up the values piece is because we've seen a lot of large companies over the years who have integrity as part of their corporate values. And as a leader, I like to distinguish between espoused values, what you say is a value for you, versus your actual value. And when respect, communication, integrity were the core values of a company called Enron, those of us that remember what happened with them, uh, they imploded because their actual value had nothing to do with integrity, communication, respect, and teamwork. It had everything to do with maximizing profits. This is the same sort of behavior that we're seeing from the big three PBMs, is they are espousing that they are a virtuous company that holds values very highly. But when you read into their code of ethics, it's really about don't break the law, let's be compliant, and let's be as profitable as possible, exploiting the loopholes in those laws.
Well said.
Hey, it's Bob Dixon here with a quick invite for you. If you're ready to revolutionize your leadership, listen up. You're invited to our new monthly workshop called Total Leader Concept. In just one session, you'll get real battle-tested strategies from my 30 plus years of military and business experience. Imagine unlocking tools that not only help you tackle challenges head on, but also empower you to inspire and transform your team. This is your chance to break free from the old habits and become the leader you're meant to be. Spots are limited, so act fast. Visit 5eaglesleadership.com/workshop and secure your seat today. And let's redefine your leadership together.
Now, if you happen to be a leader in one of those big three, my question to you is, does that actually mesh with your personal values? Are you okay with that? Because it seems to me that if you have personal values that actually have integrity in them and you see what your company is doing, I'm not sure how you feel about that. It's a struggle. And I think anybody who's in the workplace, particularly in the leadership role in any kind of company, has to take a hard look at what we say our values as a company is and what we actually do. If there's a mismatch, you are lying to yourself and you're lying to the public. And I think it's pretty rampant. I think it's pretty easy to say integrity and mutual respect are not values that are evident in the big three. So I don't know how we reach those employees of those companies and ask them that question, Daniel, because we don't have any control over that. Now there is some control in Congress, but they have been griping about this for some time now without a whole lot of action yet. What do you see on the horizon for them?
It's been absolutely a fascinating roller coaster the last 10 years. So, um, 2003 is kind of when the capability of the loophole started. So you only saw, I'm going to call them minor misplay. You had major consolidation to the point where the big three aggregated so much power that the hyperinflation of the prescription just really took off brutally the last 10, 15 years. And then Affordable Care Act, and then the big three getting, we call the big three getting their big three, right? If you have the insurance company, the PBM, and your pharmacy channel, now you can keep everybody in that pen and really brutalize them. So since then, that has created so much pressure. Independent pharmacy has been in the ear since the beginning because we're on the grassroots actually seeing the impact on patients. And I kind of want to use an example here. I want to answer your question first. We have seen more progress in the last 9 months than we had the previous 9 years combined. So
Okay.
About 5 years ago, we really started barking to the FTC saying this is affecting consumers. This is hurting people. People are going bankrupt and they don't need to. There's no reason why a $1 cost drug to manufacturers costing $600, and people can't afford their insulin, and they're having all these terrible health outcomes. So they started listening to us. They authored a 6B probe here about 2.5, 3 years ago. They gave their initial findings here last July. And as expected, this says, yes, PBMs hurt patients, manipulate to their own benefit, and purposely harm, quite frankly, their non-owned pharmacies. And I don't know if you saw the big news this week that Walgreens itself, one of the best, most dominant players, some of the best brands out there, had to sell to Sycamore, which is an asset disbursement company. So largely even Walgreens now. So the amount of players in the pharmacy space has died. Over 1/3 of pharmacies have died in the last 10 years. Okay. So we've been preaching this to the choir. FTC has issued not one, but 2 reports. The House Oversight Committee had a hearing with 140,000 pages proving this. And it's December 17th, they actually had full agreement on a bipartisan package that would save the federal government $5 billion that got kind of squashed in the whole year-end CR package. So it's still on the table. Yeah. On February 26th, there was an Energy and Commerce Committee. And can you imagine any other topic that you have unanimous agreement across the entire Energy Committee? This includes AOC on one side and most conservative Republican the other. The only thing they argued about is why didn't we get it done December 17th, and then they went into that part. So there's almost unilateral agreement that PBM reform is needed, and this might be something really of interest to your employers. Sean Grimminger, who is the head of the National Alliance of Self-Insureds, so he's there on the behalf of employers. He had excellent testimony I can send to you that said we need transparency because employers are getting sued. Employers are getting sued by their employees.
Hold on, employers are getting sued by their employees over this issue. Okay, business leaders, listen up. This is important to you.
Absolutely. Because a health plan is a benefit plan under ERISA, somebody has to be a fiduciary. The only fiduciary on record is you, Mr. Employer. So the employees are saying, Mr. and Mrs. Employer, you need to do a fiduciary duty on who you select that's taking care of us. And if you selected a vendor that is knowingly price gouging us, driving us into bankruptcy, then we're going to hold you accountable. So there's been multiple suits, and even yesterday there's major news that the employees of JP Morgan have announced a lawsuit against JP Morgan for their selection of a bad actor PBM, one of the big 3.
Oh my goodness. So as a business owner, I've got some risk now that I may not have been aware of. And if I have selected one of those big 3 as my PBM, I don't even know if I selected them. I just signed up for some healthcare so that I could take care of my folks. Exactly. But I'm the only fiduciary in that line. Is that right?
So the big 3 PBMs and health insurers have really lawyered up. They have put all the risk.
I'm sure they have.
have put all the risk on the employer. So they act in a profiteering manner. They'll just say, we did what the employer told us. Oh, the employer is busy running their manufacturing company, running the trucking company, running their consulting company. They hired a broker to make sure they had a plan that was legal. But they had no idea that the legalese was such that, hey, employer, you're the only fiduciary. If anybody's coming, you're first in line. And I got some more bad news, but I promise to end some good news. So we have done a documentary, and in it, we actually interviewed a national reputation healthcare ERISA attorney. And she said every health plan that she's seen that involves a big 3 violate federal ERISA law. So why is that bad news for employers? That means not only can you get sued by your employees, pretty soon the Department of Labor is probably going to be knocking on your door, because having 60% of the people go bankrupt and 75% fully insured, that's not a long-term viable situation, right? That has to be solved. They recognize to be solved, it has to have 2 different things have to occur. Employers, you have to become more aware that unfortunately you're getting manipulated. And then there does need to be some regulations to force transparency. And most folks don't know this, but 2 years ago, there was a very significant act called the No Surprises Act. That was actually done to prepare employers for this day. But in talking to my friends and peer groups, 99% have never even heard of it. So No Surprises Act allows the employer to ask their TPA, their health plan, or PBM how they make their money, right? So if your insurance broker says, yes, I make $25 in every vial of insulin that gets sold to your or gets prescribed to your employees, employer might say, well, wait a minute, why are you getting money for them getting insulin? That doesn't seem fair. And you'll find out that brokers have 15 different revenue streams that the PBMs health plans are paying them to direct them into certain plans.
Wow.
And then you go to the TPA.
Wow. So I guess when we're looking for that broker, we've got some different questions to ask. Now, how do we know what questions to ask? Do you have a list of questions I should be asking my next candidate for broker?
Yes. So first, there's Julie Selesnik from Berger Montag has a free list out there. There's also, happy to say, disruptors in the insurance broker industry called Health Rosetta. And there is a number, I'm going to call brokers with a conscience. They saw this occurring, and they said they have to revolutionize the broker industry, and it has to be insurance consultants. And ideally, they should be a fiduciary, or at very least, they should be a direct contract with the employer on a flat fee to execute a strategy to actually benefit the employer and the employees. Because why would you want your broker motivated for your people to be sicker? And that's
that seems like a perverse incentive right there.
Perverse incentive is a common term that's used multiple times throughout the healthcare chain because all these players in there all make more money the sicker your people are and the more money you spend. So the more you find out, you're more going, this can't be true, but it is, right? So back to that No Surprises Act. So when you find out your PBM is actually selecting a $600 brand instead of the $50 generic, and they're saying, well, yeah, but I'm giving you 50% off. But wait a minute, 50% of 500, 250 is still a lot more than 50, right? And that happens every day. And you wonder why the lawsuits, and I'm going to get very personal because this is real, and that is it's now affecting people to a point where people are dying. And that is not exaggerating. Part of what I got us motivated to be able to make this docuseries is we had a tragic death of a 22-year-old young man who's had asthma since he was 18 months old. Been the same medicine for 10 years and knew it, controlled it. 1 month his copay is $66. The next month he's told it's going to cost him $539. Okay? So you can imagine a 22-year-old, he had to choose between rent and his inhaler. Rent won. 3 days later, significant asthma attack. On the way to the hospital, he goes into cardiac arrest. He has no oxygen to his brain for too long. And 6 days later, his parents have to make the worst decision parents could ever make. Okay? So $66 to $539, what's going on? Well, it's because of the brand rebate, right? So employers, this is the part that you probably don't know is occurring that I think will probably shock you. Your PBM will say, I'm doing the best job I can because I'm trying to get the biggest rebate for you. That sounds good, but you have no idea that $500 rebate that's going to be $250, of which the PBM is going to pocket $200 and never tell you of. We'll talk about that here shortly. There's a brand equivalent. There's a generic equivalent that costs $60. And when I say generic equivalent, I'm talking about literally the same inhaler made in the same plant and the same machine. The only difference is a sticker. Okay?
Right.
Now I'm going to hit you with one more dose of reality. The actual active ingredients can be compounded for less than $1. So picture that. The active ingredients, less than $1. Someone gets a $539 and a young man died. So do you think his parents are angry about that? So you can only imagine in a court of law and a jury, if you're saying, why would you ever hire somebody that's going to charge you $500 for something that should cost 50, and now a person can't afford it, and now they pay the ultimate price. So that's where it gets very real, and now there's multiple lawsuits, and it's just the beginning. Sorry to be Danny Downer.
Wow, that doesn't sound like we're living our values there, PBMs. It sounds like we put profit before humans, which is absolutely a common criticism of the healthcare industry at large. This is just probably one of the most stark examples of that. That profitability at any cost, and in this case, the cost of a young man's life. And I know that there are lots of different examples of that. If you just checking out the 11-minute trailer on YouTube of the modern medical mafia will explain several examples of what happens when the perverse incentives go so far as denying people who could otherwise afford something, uh, just so we can line the pockets of everyone in this system, from the brokers to the PBMs to the insurance companies to the pharmaceutical makers themselves. It's pretty perverse. You know, that it seems like this is a big thing to try to go after, Daniel. I know you don't control parts of the system. You don't control any of the system, so you have to rely on what Raven, French and Raven would talk about informal powers. You don't have any formal powers. You can't direct the PBMs to start acting in congruence with their values. So you have to use those informal powers like influence, and then you have to build alliances, which is getting people to see things your way and to move in the way that is congruent with what you believe the values should be. So how are you going about building alliances and influencing the system that you have no control over?
So first, I wanted to seek out intelligent, wise people who are smarter than me on this topic, just to validate that my viewpoint was accurate. And happily to say that occurred quite quickly. Second is, okay, how do we solve the problem? And like everything else, it's multifactorial, multi-step. But ironically, one of the biggest ones is awareness. It is amazing how many very, very intelligent CEOs, CFOs, etc., have no clue that PBMs actually are in fact impacting their healthcare costs to the extent they are, right? So, and then as we got to meet folks in Washington, uh, you mentioned a number of issues, and of course that becomes its own big challenge. And I'll just use it very easy vernacular. There's the good, the bad, the ugly, right? There are some excellent legislators who truly want to do the right thing and make change because they listen to people back home who are having issues. Then let's call the folks who are influenced, and then the folks who make ultimate decisions who maybe are influenced by power and money. I guess we got to call it what it is. And do also history, right? Women's right to vote. How did that happen in 1918? People got organized. Ladies got organized, 100,000
Yes.
people marched the streets and says, enough's enough. They were well thought out. They were organized. They had a plan, and it got enough action. Of course, the 1960s was civil rights. Well, those issues have been around our country for 200 years. Why all of a sudden did it finally get solved? Because people got organized, they got educated, and we finally said enough's enough. As we looked at both those issues, we realized they were very, very important, but they were actually to segments of demographics in our society. When it comes to healthcare, it affects all of us. So we started saying, what do we actually need to solve the problem? And I actually went to a couple congressmen who are participatory in this docuseries. And that was very enlightening, as they both basically said the same thing. 10 years ago, we didn't even know what a PBM was. Then we started getting all this data on bankruptcies and realized we ought to find out. Then we had enough people saying they are manipulating healthcare. So that's why the FTC did the 6B study and how the House Oversight committee and the Senate committee actually has done a very deep dive on insulin. They said, now we know that there's a problem and that we need to solve it, but there's one last piece missing. Not enough people back in Main Street know enough about this topic to actually talk to their legislators and says we need enough mass, if you will, to finally get it over the hurdle. So when you talk about the influence, that's we said, okay, that's where we need to help this. We need to have some mechanism that we make more people aware of the truth. And I got to admit, we were blessed. My daughter sat across the kitchen table for 29 years. Her schooling is a LA filmmaker. She worked for an international film company, and she's had to listen to me explain this very topic to hundreds of people. And she said, Dad, I've listened to you for 10 years. It's complicated. It takes a lot to absorb all this. And you can't do that in an 8-second TikTok. You can't do that in a 3-minute YouTube. It needs to be something that engages folks. So it needs to be a docuseries or a film because you got to be able to weave these parts in. I get very passionate about this. I talk fast, and I tend to kind of fire hose people. So I needed someone who could tell that story in such a way that people could get a big topic, absorb it. And then as we reached out across the nation, it was amazing how many people were passionate about helping to solve this. And I think it's a natural passion because how many families have not been affected by some type of healthcare adversity, right? How many families do not have an asthmatic or diabetic or some other form? And now to end on a high note, we have an amazing number of people and facilities. We should have the best healthcare in the world. We have the facilities and the talent to do so. And ironically, the ability to do so already exists. The amount of free market, folks, and I haven't got their permission, but I don't think they're going to mind this. One of the best kept secrets is Oklahoma Surgery Center. There was a case in Wisconsin where a complicated surgery was going to cost $60,000. And when I say would have cost, there's always hidden charges when you work with a normal system. And they were the lower quartile on quality for this particular surgery. Oklahoma Surgery Center, all in, $8,000, and number one in the country in quality.
Wow. How can that be? What are they doing different?
Because they're only charging you for what you need as a consumer, as an employer. They're charging just for the facilities, the surgeon, the anesthesiologist, and nothing more. Whenever you're working with your health plan, you are paying for all that corporate greed. You know, they can't make $25 billion by just passing along cost and a fair markup. And I'll use something that almost everybody can relate to is MRIs. This will happen in most communities out there. If you go through your health plan, the employer and the employee will share a $4,000 bill. Straight up free market and literally the same building, the same machine, $400. So that's where most of us, we are used to a transparent society. When we go to a gas station, we see the price of a gallon of gas. We make a decision whether we're going to go to Joe's or Susie's gas station because we know what we're going to pay. Healthcare is the only spot where we go, we don't really know. Our little insurance card will tell us where to go. And we have no idea that insurance card is built to profiteer off you. And now they can mark that MRI up from 400 to 4,000 because you don't question it because that's what my card told me. We have
well, I do think people find it mysterious, and it's always a guessing game when you go to pick up your prescription at the counter. What is the copay going to be? It's a guess. And of course, anybody who's spent any time in a hospital, heaven forbid you should have to spend the night there, you're going to get a series of bills, not a bill. You're going to get a series of them from anybody who came by to say hi during your stay. And you may be weeks, months, or years in trying to figure it out, but most people don't. Most people don't bother to try to figure it out. They're just like, well, I guess that's what I have to pay, and they pay it. And it's really, as you call it, it's mob tactics, and when you obfuscate that, all of the stuff that happens behind the scenes to make it impossible for the average person to figure out. That is really it's the height of a con.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very interesting, and I appreciate that you brought up the historical social movements of the enfranchisement of women, the women's right to vote, and then the civil rights movement, because both of those were things that many people agreed on were screwed up and needed to change. But it wasn't until you reached a critical mass of people being angry enough or motivated enough or passionate enough to force people to pay attention to change that. And without that passion, I don't think that we collectively as a country are going to move forward on this.
Mhm.
So things like a documentary that you're putting together, and the trailer is fantastic for it. I think it's incredibly informative, and the word that you're getting out of there. Um, but that's the way real change happens. And if you look at people like Martin Luther King Jr., he did not have any formal power. He had informal power, and he was able to influence people, and he was able to get them to think differently about a problem and to consider alternative ways of doing that. One of the things that he had that was, I think, very, very specific, the same thing that the women's movement did, which is they had a specific ask.
Mhm.
We need an amendment for civil rights. We need the right to vote. Is there a specific ask for what we would like Congress to do, or what we would like our country to do, or what we'd like our healthcare leaders to do to change this system? What's the big ask?
Ironically, can we go back to our roots? Can PBMs get back to what they're originally intended for, which is just to pay that bill and then be a fiduciary on the formulary? And the answer is there are already those in existence. So there's already folks who can supplant and achieve that. The difference, though, that has to be overcome is, remember I mentioned 2003, they got an exemption for the kickbacks? That's allowed
Right.
these three to play these incredible, powerful games to manipulate prescription prices. And that is such a big black box that makes everybody else like, well, as long as that game can be played, it's like the mob bosses being the only ones who can run a scam, right? So it's ironic
Right.
because in Trump's first term, in his last 4 months, he actually had an executive order to terminate that exemption. So for us, we're going, hey, we're finally getting transparency. That's a big step. Unfortunately, that executive order got turned right back over with the new administration.
Ah,
So that's one big one. But there are already existing bills that were close to being passed that were going to save the federal government $5 billion. Right? So this is a government CBO scored $5 billion savings that didn't make it to the finish line. Now, part of it I get because the congressional games of having one great big pork sandwich at the end of December is not the best way to govern. But in this case, it hurt the patients of America because it allowed for these shenanigans to continue. So there are a number of good bills. So last session, Buddy Carter had an excellent bill. Jake Auchincloss had an excellent bill, and then Senator Wyden and Warren had an excellent bill. One was transparency and delinking, which is a fancy way of saying don't let PBMs get these um, big kickbacks and be able to do what's called spread pricing. Senator Auchincloss's HR 9096 was transparency and don't let. We forgot one other big thing. They're trying to kill all their competition. So not only do PBMs
right.
profiteer here, but they're saying everybody's a competitor. We're going to underpay you. We want you to go away, so we're the only ones left. And Senator
Right.
Warren's bill is actually to basically break up the conglomerates. That if you're an insurance company, you should not own a PBM, and if you're a PBM, you should not own a pharmacy because those are direct conflicts of interest.
Yeah, they call it vertical integration, and we call it monopolizing and manipulating. Look, I think the passion is out there in the world. I think people are angry enough of this to get a movement going. But unfortunately, a lot of times people don't know how they can help. And so you start to see things like when people figure out that United Health Group owns Optum RX, one of the top three PBMs, and the manipulation between those two. probably a consideration on why their CEO was unfortunately, I think, murdered in the streets. The passion is there. I would like to go on record as saying I don't think killing CEOs is the right way to do this. Let's get your passion focused in an area that's actually going to make lasting change, because the effect of Brian Thompson being slain was roughly zero. Nothing has changed in those industries. What will change, which will cause change, is the same thing that caused change for the women's movement and for Martin Luther King Jr. Is that when people were informed, they had a specific ask, and they called their congressman. This is how you influence the system in our society. When congressmen know they're going to lose votes, when they know they're unelectable if they don't come out on the right side of a social movement, but you got to make it a movement, folks. If you're not going to call your congressman, you're not going to show up for rallies, you're not going to even inform yourself, then you are really just complaining on social media, which gets you nowhere. Uh, this is how you influence a system in a peaceful nation, which we largely are, and I think people like Daniel Strause, who is out there informing people so that they can make those influential calls to their congresspeople, to the legislative leaders in their states and at the federal level. This is what's going to make the difference in the long run. This is what's going to help us move our healthcare system towards being the world-class healthcare system it could be.
You are so right, Bob, and thank you for saying that, because that was the ask we had of the two U.S. congressmen. They said, Dan, what's going to make a difference is what you just said. And what we were pleasantly surprised was it's amazing how few of us can actually make a difference. For instance, at the state level, 4 calls make a difference to your state legislator. Federal, it can be as little as 40. So it isn't like, I mean, we have a project. So we have a separate website called patientprotector.us. And that is meant to do exactly what you said, to make it easy for people to congregate in one space. And we'll keep people up to date on the federal legislation that is pending. And we'll even have voters' voice buttons there where you can say, okay, here's an automatic way to email your legislator that PBM reform needs to be done now. Because, we live in a time where if we all get passionate and we can make it simple for folks to follow a process, the Million Man March that Martin Luther King organized, I think was really 800,000 folks, but still Herculean, still amazing. Well, we have a situation that affects every demographic, and we have 330 million people impacted. We'd like to do our own March to a Million, where we're going to have a button on the patient protector that when this new bills could come out is let's let people know. So and then on there, hey, please call. And you're right. We also have a library of information. If anybody wants to get educated in the subject, because it is big and hairy, right? There's an awful lot to absorb. And it's hard. I mean, even in our calls, I'm sure it's like, hey, was Dan really on point here? Can I validate what he's saying is true? We'll have, the articles there. We haven't even talked about the opioid scandal. How the pharmaceuticals and the PBMs were absolutely huge factors in letting that beast unleashed, right? So the more people realize, like, wait a minute, this is going to affect my loved ones, right? So I'm hoping that the passion's there, because usually everything people care about, their families and their employees and their companies all get directly harmed by the actions that these are taking. So we're trying to make it simple for them to take action.
Well, Dan, I applaud you for the mission that you're on, and I appreciate the leadership lessons I take from this is one that you have to align your values with your company, and you have to take a hard look if you're in one of those PBMs or the insurance industry or the healthcare in any. Are you actually living the values? It really doesn't matter what industry you're in. If your company's not living the values that they say they are they compatible with your values? And if not, then why are you supporting that? Second is, how do you influence outside of things that you have control? And it's a great leadership lesson. You're obviously a great leader in this particular area, and I applaud you for having the passion and the drive to do so. I can't thank you enough for being here today and sharing your story and sharing the story of something that should be important to every employer and every American. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Bob.